Okay,
Here you go.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the May 6, 2021 meeting of the Ad hoc Committee. Is there a motion to begin the meeting?
Make a motion.
Is there a second?
I second.
Any discussion on the motion? If not, all in favor, please signify by aye or raising your hand.
Aye.
Any opposed? The meeting has begun. Thank you. Good evening to you all. Let's start with the approval of the minutes of April 8, 2021. And in my email to you this week, I, following Brian's suggestion or comment regarding the changes proposed or the comments made by Trustee Dan Natchez, I feel that the best way to go forward is to have Mr. or Trustee Natchez's email and my email made an addendum to the minutes. The minutes will speak for themselves. The best record is the recorded session. And this way we're not going back and forth or having any discussion about whether the minutes faithfully recorded his comments. So with that in mind, is there a motion to approve the minutes of April 8, and then we can have a discussion about it?
I make a motion to approve.
Is there a second? I second. Any discussion on that? What are you, any thoughts about the Natchez email and the Natchez comments, or are you okay with my suggestion?
I think they should be included.
Included as an addendum to the minutes, as opposed to figuring out who said what.
Addendum to the minutes would be my vote.
Yep.
That was your suggestion, right?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Yes.
It is.
I agree with your suggestion.
Any other comment on that?
I think that makes it easier just to try and manage that process. So I'm in favor of that.
Okay. Great. Any other comments on the April 8 minutes? If there are no further comments, is there a motion to approve those minutes? I think we had one. So all in favor of approving the minutes, please signify.
Aye.
Any
Aye.
opposed? Any opposed? The minutes of April 8 approved. Is there a motion to approve the minutes of April 29, 2021 as edited?
I'll make a motion to approve them as edited, April 29th
second?
minutes.
Thank you. Is there a second?
I second.
Any discussion on the April 29 minutes as edited?
I have a question. So the edits were from
8.
in red. Okay, got it. No discussion.
If there is no discussion, all in favor of approving the minutes, please, of April 29, please signify.
Right.
Aye.
Are there any opposed? The motion is carried. The minutes of April 29, 2021 are approved. Thank you for that. I'd like to begin tonight's meeting by recalling our discussion. John, I think you brought up the subject of the mayor being CC'd on correspondence to the ethics board. And I spoke with Yoram Miller on Tuesday and asked him about this. And as I related in my email to you all, he said that there was an ethics board mailbox created by the village, and that access to that mailbox included non-board members. So a non-board member could read communications in that mailbox. He did not recall who was included. He said that the non-members were, when they became aware of this, the non-members were deleted from the mailbox, but that the current ethics board does not use that mailbox and communicates via personal email. My follow-up to that was, well, does the mailbox still exist? And whether it does or does not, how does one communicate with the Board of Ethics? But I guess that must be on the, as I'm thinking out loud, that must be on the village website. That must be some recourse to the ethics board that way.
I would imagine that would be on the village website, but I think in many cases, boards are not aware that their individual emails may not be up on the website. So people in the community may be trying to reach them through perhaps a non-serviced email box.
Right, but
Yeah.
I think Sally told us that for various committees or boards, it's automatically sent to your personal email. So they
I
I think there's two things going on here. I think in some cases that is the case. It is automatically forwarded on. But I think in some cases where there is a general board or a commission mailbox, I don't think sometimes people are aware that there are non-board members getting distributions of those emails.
that's a separate issue that we're trying to address. Yep.
So there's two things. Some of the boards do use their village mailbox, board mailbox, and some do not.
I think-
And one other thing is, in addressing what Yoram said about using their personal emails,
Yes.
when I was on the board of trustees, it was explained to me that if I used a personal email as a village to conduct village business, that exposed my other personal email to being subject to review by the village in the event of a lawsuit.
So I guess the question is, I may have misinterpreted what he said. I would have to go back and check to see whether he's got whether the individual ethics board members have BOM mailboxes.
I can answer this question because I'm the person that raised the issue.
Okay.
And so what happened is I realized, because in my village email, I can click on the bubble and see who's on the list, that the ethics board, that many boards have other people on their distribution list. And it's whatever, currently the ethics board just has the ethics board members. That was resolved. But it did have other people on it. And the ethics board if you write an email now to ethicsboard@vomny.org, it goes to the 4 people who are on it. It goes to their personal email addresses. The zoning board and planning board were also having people that probably shouldn't have been on it. And there are a bunch of other boards and commissions that have more people, but they're not so confidential. So it's just a matter of, it's a distribution list. You think you're sending to one board, but you could be sending to more people. That's all.
So Nora,
Honestly, I think,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
well, I think that this is like not a topic for the ethics board. But to go to John's point, everybody should have a village email for doing village business. That's the cleanest way of doing it, because then you don't your personal email doesn't become subject to FOIL, or but we haven't required all volunteers to use a village email. And I
So for
don't,
example, even our own board, like we're not a board, but even our own committee,
right.
we're using our personal emails
right,
as a best practice. We shouldn't be.
right. But I honestly don't know what impact that would have on the staff. So while in a perfect world, everybody would have a VOMNY email, I don't know what burden that would place on the staff.
So
Well,
Nora,
we also did have the go ahead. I'm sorry.
no, go ahead, Mike.
No, you were first. Go ahead.
I was just gonna ask Nora if you know who's responsible for maintaining the distribution list to make sure they're just that current committee or board.
I'm not sure which of the staff people do it. So,
Okay,
and I think it's again, it's one of those things that probably changes every December when different people go off boards and come on boards. So
yep. All right,
technology is great until it's not.
So Nora, go ahead, Mike.
No, I'm sorry. I would just, recommend to the group here. I think our recommendation, or I would make a motion that, all business transacted by the board should be done using the village website. And then, the distribution, we should just establish or recommend that they establish who is getting this, just in the interest of privacy, because we've talked to a couple people, it's come up a few times about privacy concerns here, and that really struck a chord with me. So I think the best practice is, as it's been mentioned, only using the village email system, and then, clearly establish who gets what.
Well, can only focus ourselves on for purposes of the ethics code, on the ethics board. And Nora, does the website point a viewer insofar as making a complaint or communicating with the ethics board? Is there a village? Is there a VOM mailbox for that?
Yeah, I mean there is, yes. So
Should have known that one. All right.
but now it only has the 4 sitting members of the ethics board and nobody else, but there were other people on it up until a couple
Right.
of weeks ago.
Right. All right. So what I need to find out and clarify with Yoram is exactly the email domains they are using, because he said they were not using that VOM domain.
It wouldn't matter whether they were using it or not, because it's a distribution list. So if you were to send something to, I think it's Board of Ethics at bomny.org. I think that's the right one. I might not be correct. It goes to those 4 people's individual email addresses.
What I'm saying is, he told me that they are communicating with each other outside of that domain.
Right. They may be, but if
Fine.
somebody, it's whether that absolutely, yes. Because why would they? I mean, why would they use that? They have each other's emails. It's just when somebody else sends something, it was going to a wider audience. So I think I think it's a matter of just like we had to figure out Zoom etiquette in the beginning, and like to remind people that you're always being recorded, and this, whatever you say is here for posterity. I think we just need to clean up the process and let people know that this is what's going on. And I think if you are in a Microsoft environment with the village email, you can see who's on the distribution list, but somebody I don't know whether if you have Gmail, you would see who's on the list unless you hit reply all. I mean, I just don't know. But
Can I add one thing? Go ahead, Nora. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off.
that's fine. Yeah, sure.
No, it's just 2 things. And for me, this is more like on the principle about any discussions. And I recognize, like, we've had to do this. We didn't have access to another email account. So we sent emails to us using our personal account. But I think that the ethics board should be required to have any communication transit through the village server only. so that it's there and that's where they communicated and it was stored there. I don't know how anybody else feels, but I don't think anybody should be using their own personal accounts to talk about ethics matters. I would make a motion that we recommend that.
Let me find out, Mike, let me find out first what their practice is, and then I think we can.
I think we could have an opinion on all village correspondence, but we're only reviewing the ethics board, so we'll make our recommendation. Nora, you could maybe take it back for the rest of the boards, et cetera.
Yeah, and it's something that, that I've thought about a lot, and I really don't know what the burden on the staff is, but I do know that when we get a FOIL request, it's much easier because Sally can check everybody's email. So, like the staff can fill a FOIL request because they have access to all of the email accounts because it's a village server. And then we'll get a request, did you have any personal email with, X, Y, or Z? And then we have to check our own email addresses. So, the benefit to going through the village server is the staff can fill any FOIL requests.
But just going a slightly different direction, I don't disagree with the recommendation to use village email, but that's really not a code topic.
No.
Per se.
I mean, it's just a best practice. It's what, advises. It's just a
I agree.
best practice.
I agree. I think it's a best practice, and I think it could be put in the code. And I feel very strongly on this, that, it would be my recommendation. I would hope that the group would agree that they adopt this as something formal so that, future Board of Ethics know your communications regarding any topic before you must transit only through this server.
I think the reason we care is because we are continuing to say that discussions shouldn't be informal between members, between a village employee and a member. We've done all this work to ensure that that all topics, we're going to track them. So this would be included, I would think, in that section. And if things are going on outside, we haven't. We've left an opening. So, well, Ellen, I don't think, while I agree it's not a code, I think we have to address it in our recommendations on the code, that it should be referenced.
Right. So I think, though, what you just said, the way you linked it in, we can work it into the code.
Yes.
Because if we're saying as part of the code is the way we communicate, this becomes part of the way we communicate. And track the responses. It just gets baked in.
Okay, I am trying to think of a way to frame that within what our assignment is. And I suppose it goes to the question of confidentiality. And inherently, it's part of confidentiality, but we might be able to address it. In fact, in this email I sent to you, under 2113D, it states that all documents and hearings relating to the investigation and hearing of any alleged violation shall be confidential and not available for public inspection. What we're talking about is more broadly, any communication between and among members of the ethics board. But I think I'm not sure exactly how we can put that or frame that in legal language so as to address that. I'll take any suggestions on that.
I think it's just very basic that the only form of electronic communication must transit through the village's server using a Board of Ethics email account.
Okay.
And I think that's getting to the heart of what what we're all talking about. Unless I'm hearing differently, I mean, that's it. And then there's no other way to use it. And so, for tracking purposes also, and I know we've had some discussion or people have brought up, I don't want to talk about accountability, but the fact that who reviews the actions of the Board of Ethics. And this would begin a pathway that somebody could review emails and discussions amongst members of the Board of Ethics if that was necessary.
Okay. So I hear what you're saying. I think it is the sense of the committee to put that in the code. Let me work on that. And
Dan,
yes,
how about 2116, where that's where we talked about communications on opinions. Could you weave it in possibly there? It's just another suggestion.
what page are you on?
So, well, I'm looking at an old one because I think it's 23.
All right, let me go to
2116 A and a little bit of B. I think we can maybe, it's under advisory opinions, but I
got it up in front of you now.
Oh, so let me switch back. Hold on. This is where I was referencing, we talked about things that should be, is it possible to say, so this is where we talked about maintaining some records. So I'm just wondering if it could possibly be incorporated here. That
Okay, I think
interactions between members, I just can't see the top. Let me go to my version. I thought we could do it. I did a quick search on communications thinking we can bundle it with any advice on how they interact or make decisions.
I think so, but I think that would only be limiting to advisory opinions. Like, what if someone just wants to complain about someone?
Or just, yeah,
Yeah, I think it's just very narrow,
Okay.
but I think it's a good idea.
okay. What I would, I hear you on this, and in order to frame this accurately, I would like to, number one, go back and talk to Yoram again. And secondly, talk to Sally in order to, so that whatever terminology I write is consistent and accurate. And that may require my speaking to one of the village texts, so I am using the English language in an appropriate way to describe what we're trying to accomplish. All right. Good discussion. Any other ideas, thoughts about this? Okay. If not, why don't we move on? What I'd like to discuss next is on the notes to the agenda that I sent to you. We started to talk about this last week, I think, and this is the subject of notification of a private interest in a transaction under consideration by a village body. Notification is required to the individual supervisor and the village clerk. Should the code also require notification to the ethics board? Go to the page.
But are we, would an employee who may have an interest in a contract that the village is going to enter into, they would have to, according to our disclosure forms, they would have to have a, like a, I think it's a 5% or a 10% interest, correct?
I don't recall. Offhand, I can't recall.
Okay, so it's something like, but I mean, are we saying any interest or are we saying a 5 or 10% interest?
We're saying whatever is consistent with this section C.
Because there may be, the village may enter into contracts where somebody, an employee has an interest, but they have nothing to do with making the decision about the contract. Or may not even be aware of the contract.
Right, but the question that Dan's asking is, who should be notified? Should the Board of Ethics be notified in addition to,
Okay, but going back to the first part, there may be contracts that the village enters. I'm an employee of the village. I own I own a hardware store. The village goes to my I'm a part owner in a hardware store. The village goes to my hardware store to buy, $5,000 worth of paint every year. The village is, gonna go to the go and buy the paint this year, but I'm not. I work in accounting, or I work in some other area of the village where I don't have any say in the purchase. It's just coincidental that they're buying, and I might not even know of that that issue until after the fact, if I ever know. You know what I mean? There are all kinds of instances like this.
Yes, but John, what you're talking about is defining an interest. That's not what this section, we can back up and talk and go into the definition of an interest. But what this section addresses is, on the assumption that you have an interest as defined by the code, who do you disclose it to? And this section says you disclose it to the village clerk treasurer. On the record, you disclose it on the record to the village clerk treasurer, and then it says the Board of Ethics shall review such disclosures in a timely manner. And it leaps, there's an inference there that the Board of Ethics knows about it. So somebody's got to let the Board of Ethics know, and there's a gap there. So my question, before we get to what defines an interest, my question is, shouldn't that notification also go to the Board of Ethics so they know what there is to review?
I say yes.
I agree. I say yes.
I have no problem with the Board of Ethics being notified, but there may be things that the Board of Ethics would be notified about, which they don't really need to review.
And they don't.
Yeah.
I just think this goes back to the point where we had with the village attorney in that role there on the Board of Ethics. I think in this scenario, it goes to the Board of Ethics like everything else, because that's the board that's responsible for it. And then they have the final opinion to sign off on something or acquire further. So, in this scenario or any scenario, the only people in my mind who should have the final authority, at least as it stands now, is the Board of Ethics. And so everything should go to them.
Well, there's interest defined in the code.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So my point being, an employee or a board member may have an interest in something that the village is doing,
Mm-hmm.
but may not in fact even be aware of the village's actions or, so, I mean,
Right, but John, I think all we're saying here, and we'll stick with your example, someone in accounting owns X% of a local hardware store the village does business with.
right,
That person puts it on the annual disclosure form
right,
and it gets reported to what we're trying to answer, but the clerk treasurer and maybe the
Sure.
Board of Ethics. And the Board of Ethics may say it's not an issue because someone in accounting has nothing to do with purchasing decisions. Not a problem. And it's done.
right. I understand that, but that to me, that's a decision that's being made by the ethics board, be that is as it may. And so there should be a record of that sort of, if it gets brought to that point, there just should be, in an effort to be as fair as possible, the ethics board should just keep a record of those things. So that way, if a similar issue arises, they can deal with it similarly.
Agreed. And there will be a record if the ethics
Right.
board is so notified.
Well, I mean, this is beyond just a decision. This is beyond a ethics board decision. This is just sort of in this case, it may be an FYI to the ethics board from whatever supervisor of whatever department.
Well, the language of the statute does say the ethics board shall review.
Right.
So I think it's covered. And I think what we do is we close a loop, an open loop, by requiring notification to the ethics board, so they can, no one can say, well, who was supposed to let the ethics board know? Here, the ethics board will know. So I heard a couple of yes for the ethics board, including the ethics board. Are we agreed on this?
Yeah, I just wonder who should be notifying the ethics board, whether it's the supervisor once they get notified, or whether it's the person who has an interest.
I say both. Over notification.
You can't make, I don't think you can make it both. It's gotta be clear.
No, I think it can be clearly both. Whoever it comes to attention, if the supervisors are made aware of this by the subordinate, the supervisor should have a responsibility to do it. If the subordinate doesn't notify anybody, well, then the subordinate should just be required to tell them. Like the subordinate, if it goes to the supervisor and says, what do you think here? I think that the supervisor should have a responsibility to make the notification. If the subordinate just thinks about it themselves, then they're on the hook by themselves.
But we're saying that this supervisor, or the next person up the ladder is supposed to be notified. So
Right, but I thought with the overall disclosure form process,
mhm.
the clerk treasurer's office is the one who collects them. And they then send them on to whomever, whether it be the supervisor, Board of Ethics. But I think the initial input is the clerk treasurer.
My concern is that we have so many, we've said, commission, district, department, committee, agency, go figure out who the immediate supervisor is and what their responsibility is, rather than, in my opinion, impose upon a supervisor the responsibility to transmit that disclosure to the ethics board. I think it's more organized and centralized if it's done by the clerk treasurer. It's kind of an easy pass off.
But I think it still goes back to who's responsible to notify the clerk treasurer that there is
Oh, I think it's the individual.
I agree. I think the individual should have to, that puts the onus and the responsibility on that person.
Yep.
Okay.
I'm okay with that. I'm just saying, if something comes to the attention of that person's supervisor, I've been consistent with this. I think that person should have a responsibility to report it up, and they can't just say, "Well, I did nothing." I think it is appropriate for a supervisor to take action, and I think we should formalize this.
Well, I hear you on that, Mike. As I said, my concern is that I think we're going to find some differences between and among these various boards, courts, commissions, districts, etc. And I'm concerned that something will get lost trying to figure out who exactly gets notified.
Right,
But going to Mike's point though, if a supervisor feels that they need to, they can always go to the ethics board.
Yep, that's what I was just gonna say. I think we write the code to follow the norm and what's supposed to happen. And I appreciate it's an ideal world. Things are gonna fall through the cracks. And I think what you brought up, Mike, is something that a supervisor finds out, which says to me the normal process of events did not occur, in which case the supervisor should be reporting that to the Board of Ethics. As
Exactly.
any infraction would be reported to the Board of Ethics.
I think it eliminates wiggle room, because if the person said, "Well, my supervisor told me, no, I was okay, it wasn't a big deal." I just think that if it comes to the supervisor's attention, no matter how, that they realize they cannot make a decision on this and that they must report it up.
But if we write it so that we put the burden on the employee, then the employee can't say, "My supervisor told me not to worry about it," because in the first instance, the employee has a duty to report it.
Exactly. I'm good with that. I don't want them seeking guidance, meaning the employee, from anybody except who they're supposed to, and that's the Board of Ethics.
Well, I think we can make that clear. Any other comment on that? Okay, I will draft this and circulate it. And if there's nothing further on that, let's go to the second point on the agenda notes, and that is whether the ethics board should be empowered to require witnesses at a hearing to testify under oath. The model codes do not address this. And I emailed Mark Davies this week. Mark Davies was one of the authors of a couple of the chapters in the ethics manual published by the New York State Bar Association. And I asked him in the email, should or do ethics boards call for, or do ethics boards have the authority to require sworn testimony? And let me just go to his reply so I am correct. And what he said is, "I have seen it required in some codes, but what's important, I think, is that the ethics board be empowered to compel testimony and administer oaths. Then it's up to the ethics board whether to do so in a particular case. I'd probably leave it at that." So that was his reply. And since our code is silent as to whether the ethics board can compel testimony under oath, I felt that it's something that it's a tool that they should have at their discretion, because we cannot envision what kind of matters they will be reviewing and hearing. We have heard both sides. We have heard our people say there should be sworn testimony, and others say there should not be. One point of view being, well, if you're going to make an allegation, you might as well swear to it and swear to the facts under oath. And others saying, well, no, it's empowering, it's over empowering the ethics board. My own view is that I think it's something we should put into a revised code so the board has that if they choose to. What do you all think?
Can I say something?
Yeah, go.
You know, in terms of the sworn testimony, it's really two separate things, because you say make an allegation. And, you know, I don't know yet what I feel, but I feel like an allegation doesn't necessarily have to be sworn, but possibly when testimony is provided during a hearing, that might be an appropriate place for sworn or even unsworn. But if we leave it to the discretion, if somebody does not want to be sworn, I think we should, you know, have the attorney research, you know, the value of evidence that the board could place on the value of that testimony, either being sworn or unsworn. You know, it could be deemed a greater level of evidence if a person swears to it, and that the board should take that into consideration, as opposed to when somebody provides testimony that is unsworn.
Well, I think by its very nature, sworn testimony carries greater weight than unsworn testimony, because sworn testimony carries with it a penalty of perjury if someone lies.
No, I agree. I think we just put that in there, that, you know, if somebody chooses not to be sworn, that the board, you know, pursuant to law, does not have to take it at whatever level, you know, or.
And I don't think you can do that. I really don't think you can go that far. I think that inherently a board may or may not consider the weight of testimony or an unsworn account, but I don't think you can write into the code what we think, how much weight we think the board should give.
Maybe the attorney providing them guidance puts it in there, but I would hate to see where somebody wanted to come forward, but they had pertinent or useful information, but they refused to be sworn.
But if someone were merely reporting an allegation that they'd heard to the ethics board, or were requesting that the ethics board inquire of something, it doesn't, that in and of itself does not necessarily call for sworn testimony. What we call for sworn testimony is if a complainant accused trustee John Doe of taking a bribe. And in that circumstance, the ethics board might say, if you are saying you have direct evidence of a bribe and you are making that allegation, we are going to require that you swear to the truth and contents of your allegation. And it gives them the discretion to require that of someone. And if someone backs down and says, I mean, if literally someone said, I saw John Doe take an envelope with $1,000 in cash, but that person is unwilling to swear to it, then I think the requirement for sworn testimony becomes a good instrument for testing the integrity of the complainant, and is useful for purposes of evaluating the allegation. Any other comment on that? Should we give the board the authority to take sworn testimony?
I say yes.
Anyone else?
You know,
Yeah,
Dan,
think it's required.
I'll be honest with you, I don't even know if I'm qualified to comment on this any further. I mean, it's just so legal that, I mean, maybe it's something that the board, you know, should be told, you know, they need to seek legal guidance on. You know, the only part I feel strongly about is that the receipt of an allegation should be in any form, and that it should allow the board to open up and look at what they want to. And I don't want to do anything to prevent information flowing to the board. I think it's more important that a matter is vetted so that it's either, you know, found to be truthful or untruthful. And I wouldn't want to stop that with somebody having to be sworn.
Okay. And I don't think such a provision would forestall that.
Right, I wasn't saying they had to be sworn, but that the board's allowed to swear in testimony. Or hear sworn testimony.
Brian, I can't hear you.
I didn't say anything, but
Oh, I'm sorry. Who just spoke then? I'm sorry.
That was Ellen.
Oh, sorry, Ellen.
That's all right. I wasn't saying that it was mandatory that it be sworn testimony.
Okay, well, are there any other comments on that? What I propose to do then is draft such a section, and I will inquire I'll get the opinions of the present and former chairs. And again, this is not etched in stone. We're going to be making a recommendation to the trustees. So there's plenty of time in front of us to discuss this further. And I can also inquire of the village attorney, of Mr. Spolzino, and get his views on it. And I think that's a good point, Mike. And I will follow up on that. Okay, let's move on.
And Dan, can I offer one thing?
Yes.
I have to drop to get into this next meeting that I'm late for, and I apologize to the group. Do we still have a quorum if I leave?
Yes, we do.
Okay, thanks. I'll talk to you guys later. I'm sorry. I held out as long as I could.
No worries. Thank you, Mike. I'd like to switch to the subject of the process map. Ellen, I turn that over to you now to discuss any input you got and what your thoughts are. And Jocelyn.
You're the only one who sent me anything, so I haven't heard from anyone else. But I did take a look at your recommendations. On recusal, there's really no process. The person recuses him or herself. You know, there's nothing to map out. The rest, you know, we can work on.
Okay.
That was, you know, basing off what you had sent, Dan. And when I looked through it, you know, I agree. I mean, once you recuse, it's, you know, there is no review of a recusal, and in fact, you can't. You don't even have to share why you feel that you are recusing.
Okay, I did very intentionally attempt to create a very broad list that might contemplate any kind of a process map. So
I had some comments because, you know, I did go through it and I had some thoughts. There's the disclosure form, and then there's the disclosure of there's a disclosure of interest where there may or may not be a recusal. And then there's a disclosure of interest where somebody says, I am recused, and there needs to be no further review of it. and their participation is no longer required. But going sort of back to what we had discussed earlier, my notes, I mean, who do we disclose when there's a disclosure of interest on the disclosure processes? Who do we disclose that to? Is it always going to be, we already rehashed that. And the last part was sort of the statute of limitations part about ethics board investigations and how long we can, while I don't know that it's directly a process issue, it's how far out are we allowing people to sort of be pulled back? And I noticed that you had said that the statute is 6 years in New York State. But I had a quick question, because is this 6 years from the action, the vote that may or may not have been taken, or 6 years from the last benefit somebody might have received?
Let me go to the section.
I think it was towards the back, I think.
Where's my fine?
And I don't know that it's necessarily a process issue, but it's just, something that occurred to me, if something gets referred to the ethics board 6 years after it's happened, is it the act itself, or is it the last time somebody received a benefit from the
act? So by an act would take in the receipt of a benefit.
Okay. All right.
So whatever corrupt act or in an ethical, illegal act occurred, if money changed hands, that act occurred on that date.
Yeah. Okay. I'm sorry, Ellen, I didn't mean to hijack things.
Not a problem. But I repeat, Dan's list was the only list I received. So I don't know if anybody else has any other things they think should be mapped out.
Or I'm sorry. I was gonna respond, but I thought Dan covered a lot of the stuff. But
Okay.
the only suggestion I had is maybe like the actual record keeping of the advisory opinions, like who maintains them, how are they maintained? What if someone, I guess that would be FOIL.
Well, we've also never discussed that, and that's not really part of the code. So what I'm trying to get at here, and at the last meeting, Dan asked what I was thinking about the RACI matrix, and this kind of gets to that. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that I went through a lot of Six Sigma training. So, we have all this code, and the village had no documented processes to support the code itself. And, like the thing we were just discussing, the Board of Ethics reviews, but there's no handover to the Board of Ethics. So, and when the mayor joined us, he wasn't aware that the code actually said they're supposed to review the list of who has to do a disclosure form every year. So that's really where I thought some of our documentation as an appendix could help. It's really not part of the code itself, but I don't think it's our job to, and it's not that I mind doing it, but I think would be stepping on toes a lot, to overreach and say, or we don't have a record keeping function and this is what it should be and how you should do it, and blah, blah, blah. You know, we can point out that there's a gap and someone needs to take ownership. And I think that could be between the clerk treasurer and the Board of Ethics to figure out who should be maintaining that library of opinions.
Yeah. I mean, I
And
thought,
NIT, because it needs to be made available to people.
Mhm. Yeah, you're right. No, I just saw we suggested public record keeping of the advisory opinions. I wasn't sure where we landed on that.
No, I think we did agree on that, but we don't have any process for it. Because we don't know who owns it. You know, it's not something that existed.
I thought we said village clerk. Did we? I'm not sure.
I thought so. I thought the village clerk keeps these.
The opinions, they're not kept now.
No?
Well, so much of
No.
it's not documented today.
No, I mean, I'm sorry. Like, we're suggesting that the village clerk should maintain a record. So I just think that should be part of the process map.
Yeah, but again, then that's one step. You know, the Board of Ethics reaches a conclusion, turns it over to the clerk treasurer.
Here it is in B. Here it is in 2116B. Advisory opinions and requests shall be indexed and maintained on file by the ethics board. The ethics board shall provide a copy of advisory opinions to the village clerk. The clerk shall maintain a file of advisory opinions.
Right, so how is it? That's not a process, really.
Well, I think we don't need to get, I don't think we can get past that.
Right, no, so I'm just saying there's really nothing for me to map out here.
I agree.
Yeah.
But
And
I do,
the call last week, which isn't really in the code, Jocelyn recommended that we map out, so this is above and beyond your email, Dan, how someone goes, you know, what happens if you have a question or an issue?
Hmm.
You know, what are the steps followed?
yeah,
What the individual does, who does the next step, so on and so forth.
I think it would be a great service if we created these process maps. They're not law, but they are instructive.
Yep,
And I think it would be would really clarify a lot of the code for people if
Yep.
we did that.
so last week you asked what my thoughts were on what we do with the RACI matrix. And if I remember correctly, I kind of punted in the answer. So I've been thinking about it, and I think I said maybe is an appendix to this. But I just think it's a useful document that we turn over to the clerk treasurer's office, the village manager, and the board of trustees. Board of ethics and village attorney.
I agree.
Just as a useful document, and if they want to toss it, they toss it.
I agree.
But not part of the code.
Yes, correct. Any other? So now where do we go with the process maps? I've made the recommendations on the sections that should be considered, not necessarily the sections that need to have maps. But I think more is better in this category insofar as telling a village employee or anybody covered by the code what you do when a situation arises. I think that's what the map addresses.
Yep.
And I think having this as an appendage to the code is very useful for a guide for people to follow, particularly as it relates to code distribution, receipt, acknowledgement. First thing that happens is the list of applicable disclosure, the disclosure processes. first the list is created, the list goes out, disclosure forms are submitted, completed, they're submitted, they're acknowledged. This is the kind of thing, you apply dates to it, that clears up a lot of confusion.
Yep, and that's the sample one that I did a couple of weeks ago.
Yep. And the same with code distribution, receipt acknowledgement.
Yep.
Okay, great. So here's my suggestion for going forward. I suggest that we have a couple of couple of additional modifications to make to the code based on our discussion tonight. And I have some inquiries to make regarding sworn testimony. What I propose is that I make those changes, I send them to you. And at the same time, I would like to start drafting an interim report. And not meet next week, but if I have some time to write this, get it to you so you can read it and make edits before over the next week or so, and meet in 2 weeks and go over the sections that I will have addressed. I will be communicating with you in the interim. And also we can discuss the interim report that I hope to draft. Because I think essentially we're done with the major portions that we were going to address. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that's a great idea, but I'm not available on the 20th.
But you are available to read what I send you and comment and edit so that we'll have your comments before.
Yes.
And it's only another meeting because once I get some feedback, I can then put the draft in more or less final form, and then we can agree on it.
Yep.
How about the others? What are your thoughts on that?
That sounds fine to me. That's definitely doable, or at least on my part. I've got, you have the hard work.
Anyone else? Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm okay with it.
I was going to ask you to write it, Brian.
My weekends are free.
I am so teasing you. Okay. Any other business this evening? If not, then I think we may be done, and I'll proceed on that basis and be in touch with you all. There's no other business. Is there a motion to adjourn?
I make a motion to adjourn.
Second?
I second.
Any discussion? If not, all in favor, please say aye or raise
Aye.
hands. The motion is carried. Thank you all. Have a wonderful evening. You will hear from me, I promise you, over the next week or so, and I hope you can get your comments back to me as early as is convenient for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Laura, thank you.
You're welcome.
Bye.
Bye-bye.